Welcome to the start in a Legendarium series about medieval lore. Today we'll be covering the zombie tales of Old England. It's pretty hard to escape zombies today, not because we're living in the zombie apocalypse, though if you open a book or turn on the television you'd probably think so. However, tales of the Walking Dead long predate the movies and television. Indeed, folks in medieval Europe had their own ideas about death and the shambling dead. First, we'll be talking about the medieval death cult and how pervasive it was in medieval society. Then we'll be talking about 3 medieval zombie tales recorded by William of Malmesbury: the tale of Ralph and Edith, the tale of the Plaguebringer, and the tale of Hundprest. And then finally we'll talk about how these 3 tales, and no doubt many others like it, inspired people to take preventative measures against zombies in real life. While death is alien and frightening to us, it was something experienced by people every day in the Middle Ages. Remember, most people in the Middle Ages didn't make it past the age of 40, and anyone who made it past the age of 50 was in Methuselah territory. If you had a child, there was only a 1 in 2 chance that they would even make it to the age of 15, and even lower if you lived among the filth of a major city like London or Paris. So many people died that there literally wasn't enough space in the cemeteries, and bones had to be stacked up in charnel houses called ossuaries. In the ossuaries, people arranged the bones and skulls in an artistic way, and usually with a Christian message, urging people to think about how little time they might have on earth. To decorate the ossuaries, medieval artists painted images collectively called the Danse Macabre, which showed different members of society being carried away by the dancing dead. Though grim, they often had a comic element, with hypocrites being caught by death while with adulterous partners, and doctors challenged by mocking skeletons to cure their own death. During the Middle Ages, cemeteries weren't just places to lay the dead, they were places of social gathering. All the big events were held there, including local elections, trials, sermons, even theatrical productions. Prostitutes even operated from the graveyard, and since the graveyard belonged to the church, they were free from taxes, so small businessmen took advantage of this loophole and opened up shop among the graves. And apparently even the dead thought it was getting too crowded in the cemetery because, according to tale-tellers of the time, they rose from their graves and walked among the living, making horrible groaning and murmuring sounds that terrified those still living. Indeed, these tales of revenants caused great alarm, because if they were caused by the will of God, then it was a miracle. But if witchcraft was involved, then an exorcism needed to be performed. And we're going to be covering 3 medieval tales of the Walking Dead, all written by William of Newburgh, who wrote a book in the 1100s called The History of English Affairs. Remember, histories back then weren't strict attempts to be impartial, but they mixed folk tales and Christian parables in with real events to teach readers moral lessons. In his literature, William of Malmesbury argues that the dead come back to life to torment the living, with howling and murmuring through the night, that they are generally people who were evil in life and continued to do evil after death, and many of them brought the very real-life problem of the plague with them. Remember, this is a time before penicillin and even basic medical procedures, so plague was a constant threat to medieval people. And it's not too surprising that their folklore would often involve tales of the plague. The first story tells of a man named Ralph and his wife Edith. Ralph, as all people do, died one day, and he was buried with Christian ceremony. However, he still crawled out of his grave and walked into the chamber of his widowed wife, and when he tried to couple with her, Ralph almost crushed his wife Edith with his bloated, marbled body. As you can imagine, Edith objected to this, and she called upon the brothers of the deceased Ralph to help her. They appealed to the Bishop of Lincoln himself, who wrote a letter to the parish priest granting him permission to investigate Ralph's body. When the parish priest, the widow, and the brothers dug up the body, they found it surprisingly intact, not rotting at all. So they placed a cross in the tomb along with the bishop's letter, sealed it up again, and that was the end of the matter. In this story, we can see a warning against clinging to things that no longer belong to us, as Ralph did to his wife, along with an admonition to remain faithful to God and the Church. However, William of Newburgh wrote another version in which the squeamish bishop refused the parish priest permission to dig up the reanimated corpse, and the angry villagers simply dug up the corpse on their own and burned it, suggesting that people were not above disobeying orders if they felt their souls were at stake. William of Newburgh wrote a second story about strange events in Scotland, where a thief, liar, and general troublemaker named Angus had died. And being a true scoundrel, Angus refused to stop plaguing his neighbors even after death. So he crawled out of the grave, wandered around the village, and gathered a pack of loudly barking dogs around him. Wherever he walked, Angus polluted the very air, causing people to catch the plague. Open sores blistered the noses and mouths of those who breathed in the pollution, and soon they took to their sickbeds. This reflects a common medieval belief that the plague was in fact caused by polluted air. So 10 especially bold and brave young men followed the corpse of Angus back to the cemetery after he finished a nightly round. Among his other sins, Angus had been a boastful man, and he would brag to the villagers that as long as he remained unburned, they would have no peace. And so the 10 men dug up the corpse, dragged it to some empty place, and set it on fire. In yet another medieval morality tale, we see the boastful being undone by their own bragging. And while many had died from the plague in the village, it soon passed once the pestilential corpse was taken care of. In reading the story, we can't help but wonder if there's an element of wish fulfillment as people yearn for a simple solution to cure the plague which causes the deaths of so many people. The third story involves a sinful priest known as Houndprest, or Hound Priest. Because of his excessive love of hunting, Houndprest neglects the needs of his parishioners. Indeed, he was so sinful that he even kept a mistress. Houndprest's way of living eventually caused his death, and just like Ralph in the first story, Houndprest refuses to leave his mistress alone. Houndprest breaks into her bedchamber and tries to couple with her, no doubt with similar results. To rid herself of this tormentor, the mistress turns to a monk, who stands guard at her bedchamber with an axe. When Houndprest shows up again, the monk buries the axe up to the handle in the creature's chest. Apparently finding it none too comfortable, the frightened creature scurries back to his grave. The monk then digs up Houndprest's body and burns it. This story shows a certain ambivalence towards the medieval church. On the one hand, we see corrupt priests indulging in pleasures of the flesh while neglecting the needs of their parishioners, which was indeed a problem reported on in the Middle Ages. However, at the same time, the story seems to advise readers to seek redemption in the innocence and purity of monks. In these three tales, we see that medieval people believed that those who led evil lives might come back from the grave to continue tormenting the living, along with the very real possibility that they could bring the plague with them. And these stories did have some very real consequences. Whenever plague befell a medieval village or some other terrible misfortune, people were likely to believe that the dead were rising. So they went to the graveyards and started digging. If they found a corpse they didn't like the looks of, they would chop off the arms and limbs so they couldn't walk about, and even burn the bodies. Others had the bones broken or body parts chopped off. Some of the milder treatments involved having crosses or raven's feet buried in the tomb in the belief that this would keep the dead in their graves. This serves to remind us just how alien the medieval mind is from our own. And this wraps things up for this episode of Channel Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you again in a couple of days.